On November 22, 1963, shots rang out over Dealey Plaza, the location where the 35th President, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. One of the most compelling questions of our time asks, who fired the shots which killed the President of the United States? In an attempt to answer this question, a passionate debate has intensified for almost 30 years. On one side, the Warren Commission, a special committee formed to investigate the assassination, found that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing the president. However, in 1978, the House Select Committee, formed to reinvestigate the assassination, concluded that more than one gunman was involved in the shooting of John F. Kennedy. It was this debate which formed the basis for the 1992 annual meeting of the American Bar Association Section of Litigation mock trial. The case, United States versus Lee Harvey Oswald. The trial participants included distinguished trial judges, prosecution and defense attorneys, and expert witnesses. The panel of judges included the Honorable William Matthew Byrne, Jr., United States District Court Judge of Los Angeles, the Honorable Carol A. Corrigan of the Alameda County Superior Court, and the Honorable Sam C. Pointer, Jr., U.S. District Court Judge for the Northern District of Alabama. The team of attorneys representing the prosecution were James J. Brosnahan of Morrison and Forrester, Joseph W. Cochette of Cochette, Ilston and Petrie, and John W. Kecker of Kecker, Brockett and Van Est. The defense attorneys included Thomas D. Barr, David Boyes, and Evan Chesler, all members of the firm Cravath, Swain, and Moore. Experts retained by the prosecution included Dr. Robert L. Pizziali, biomechanics expert of failure analysis, and the experts retained by the defense included Dr. Roger McCarthy, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Failure Analysis. Organized as an educational forum, the trial represented an examination of the process rather than the definitive word. For the purposes of this forum, time constraints were placed on both sides, and only a portion of the available evidence was used. Spectus Technologies, a firm specializing in scientific and engineering visualization services and video presentation systems for the courtroom, provided the demonstrative evidence for both the prosecution and defense. Engineering visualizations were used throughout the trial, from opening statements to closing arguments. In accordance with the theme of this event, newer methods of presenting demonstrative evidence in today's courtrooms were used in concert with the traditional methods. Dr. Ray Dills, General Manager of Spectus Technologies and Vice President of Failure Analysis, explains our role in the mock trial.
You know, this has been a voluntary effort on everyone's part. So we formed two teams in failure analysis, and there was a marvelous internal competition between the two teams. And Spectus, when Spectus Technology gets the technical information, we simply transform it into a picture, but we don't change it in any manner. So it's just a transformation.
So you make a distinction between physics and law in the courtroom?
Oh yeah. What we do is we just replicate the physics, and then how the lawyers choose to use it is their business.
The presentations included text retrieval, court boards, graphics, photography, an 8-by-8-foot mural of Dealey Plaza, video production, and three-dimensional computer animation. All images were produced, stored, and accessed by laser disc media and displayed on 10 large-screen monitors for viewing from any position in the mock courtroom and in the auditorium. And now, Spectus Technologies would like to take this opportunity to review with you some of the highlights which show how the demonstrative evidence was used by both sides during the trial. Joseph Cochette opened with the prosecution's case.
What do we have to prove, the government have to prove, in this case? You just heard Her Honor read you the indictment. It is 3 simple points. The simple points that are made are the following. 1, we have to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald shot the weapon, that is to say, shot President Kennedy. Next, we have to show, number 2, that the shot that Lee Harvey Oswald fired killed the president. First, the firing of the shot, then the kill. And third, we have to show that Lee Harvey Oswald deliberately and with intent pulled the trigger of this weapon and shot the president.
Continuing on, Mr. Cochette used computer animation in his opening arguments to familiarize the jurors with the layout of Dealey Plaza.
There, ladies and gentlemen, is an overhead of the plaza. Now, what we've done to recreate this, you'll see us recreating it right now. We took an aerial photograph and we animated it. And this is the route that the president's motorcade took. The Texas Book Depository is the furthest view on your left now. The car is turning on Houston Street, and we will show you that in a moment. It drives down Houston Street, and if you can look in the middle of the screen, you will see the 6th floor open window of the book depository. The car turns onto Elm Street. It goes down Elm Street. The bullets are fired at him, and I will explain why they weren't fired down Houston Street. And let me show you now what we've done to reenact the close-up of the window. That is the 6th floor window from which the shooting was done. We will show you by computer graphics how that looked from the window. There is the view you would have looking down Houston Street. You will note at the bottom you cannot see out over the ledge unless you lean over it. And the perfect killing shot, as will be described, is down Elm Street, not up Houston Street. And that is the shot that Lee Harvey Oswald took. Here is the automobile. If you were leaning out the window, if you were leaning out the 6th floor window, you would see that car go by.
In order to support the prosecution's case, an investigation team from Failure Analysis Associates was assigned to examine the scientific evidence attempting to prove Oswald's guilt. After a thorough investigation of the available information, the team focused on the evidence which related to how many shots were fired, where the shots were fired from, and was Oswald capable of firing the shots in the time available? How many shots were fired that day? In this photograph, Harold Norman, who was in the school book depository on the day of the assassination, was located at position B, just below where Oswald was said to have fired from, position A.
It was like this.
Of 171 witnesses, 132 agreed that 3 shots were fired. The prosecution said that the 3 shots were fired as the president traveled down Elm Street. The first shot missed, the second struck the president in the back, and the third was the fatal headshot. Remarkably, these events were recorded by a Dallas businessman, Abraham Zapruder, on his 8mm movie camera. This famous record of the assassination has been analyzed in great detail, frame by frame, and is the basis for many analyses of the assassination. The prosecution asserted the first shot was fired at frame 166 of the Zapruder film.
You see, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will clearly show there were 3 shots fired, all in a period of about 8 seconds, and you will hear exactly how it could be done. It could be done in 6 seconds if you hurried the shots. Now, what you'll see here is you will see the president's arms going up. And this, tragically, is just after a shot penetrates through the back of his neck and comes out right under his tie. And what are the hands doing like that? That is a natural reflection that you will hear of his hands going up. To move it. He has a shot in him. Jacqueline Kennedy leans over to comfort her husband. He is slouching down and turning to the left. Now, I want you to look at the position of the president as Mrs. Kennedy is reaching for his neck to see what might be wrong. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the instant before Lee Harvey Oswald takes the weapon, puts it at the back of his head, squeezes the trigger quickly, and you will now see the next frame. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the president's head receiving the fatal bullet.
Prosecution expert Dr. Robert Pizziali, Vice President of Failure Analysis and an expert in biomechanics and reconstruction, used the famous Zapruder film, accident reconstruction techniques, and computer animation to demonstrate the geometry and timing of the theorized 3 shots.
Would you tell the jury very briefly what methods you used in order to carry out that task?
There's very little evidence for the first shots. The question is, what happened to it? If you look at the view from the scope produced by the FBI, in this area there are things that the bullet could have been deflected off of. This is actually a structure that supports a stop light, and a little further on you'll see that the president goes behind trees. So we don't know exactly what happened with that bullet, but there is the opportunity for deflection. The second shot, however, we have some evidence. I believe that a single bullet created the wounds to the president and the governor. In order for that to be true, we have to have the path of the bullet being consistent. Now, the way we did this is we had to develop the geometry associated with the shooting. We did this by creating a computer animation of Dealey Plaza. What you saw first there was an aerial photo. By using 2 aerial photos, we developed the complete 3-dimensional geometry of Dealey Plaza. We then create an engineering animation of Dealey Plaza, which is geometrically exact to within a couple of feet. We can then take photos of the buildings and do what's called texture mapping, so the facades of the building look as they do in Dealey Plaza. So consequently, through our engineering animation, we have a physically correct and a visually correct representation of Dealey Plaza. The next thing we did is we made a model of the car. The model of the car was based on dimensions that appear in the literature, plus we sent one of our staff to actually look at the limousine. We recreated the limousine, and now we can actually move the limousine through Dealey Plaza.
Through the use of reverse projection techniques, Dr. Pizziali was able to accurately determine the position of the president and the governor in the car, and the position of the car within Dealey Plaza.
You'll see is a fade. That's the Zapruder film. Watch the governor and the president. What you'll see is the animation has put the governor and the president in the exact same position they were in Dealey Plaza in 1963. Where does the shooter have to be? Where is the sniper that makes this shot? We drew a straight line through the president's back wound and the governor's chest wound. What we found is that the sniper has to be somewhere within that cone, and you can see that that cone is almost centered on the 6th floor Texas School Book Depository southeast window. Now, in order to see what that actually looks like, what the bullet would look like going through 2 people, I have a piece of footage here that shows that. What happens is we have the 2 people placed as you see them in the car. The bullet now starts to tumble. We do know it's tumbling because the entrance wound is too large for a non-tumbling bullet. It deflects through the chest, comes out, goes through the wrist, and enters the thigh.
Dr. Pizziali continued, explaining the origin of the 3rd shot, the fatal shot to the head which killed the president.
You can see that the head wound occurs at frame 313. It's approximately 5 seconds after frame 224. Therefore, there's 5 seconds for a sniper to make that shot, which is more than enough time for that to occur. So what we then did was use the same reverse projection techniques, located the models in the car, located the president in the car, located the head wounds on the president, located the sniper cone, and then looked at where the individual would be to shoot the president and hit him in the back of the head. And again, when you look at that cone, it heads right back up to the 6th floor, northeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository.
In contrast to the prosecution's burden to prove Oswald's guilt, the defense team would raise questions and doubt that Oswald assassinated the president. Thomas Barr, representing the defense team, began.
The defense believes that the evidence leaves, after 30 years, Dealey Plaza, the place where the president was shot, still filled with the doubts about what happened, as it was on the day that the president was shot. And we believe those doubts are such that in this case, where the government has the burden of proving to you beyond a reasonable doubt, we will submit to you that it cannot carry that burden, that despite every effort, it cannot put the pieces together in a way that a reasonable person will say, aha, I see they fit.
In order for the defense to succeed in establishing reasonable doubt, Dr. Roger McCarthy, president of failure analysis and an expert in mechanical engineering and ballistics, was consulted to investigate Oswald's action as an assassin. The discussions focused on Oswald's marksmanship, the weapon used, and the selection of shots which Oswald was alleged to have chosen.
Well, when he was in basic training, he barely shot sharpshooter. By the time he had to re-qualify, he barely shot adequately to stay an active duty Marine. He was 191 over the minimum of being 190. That would be called a marksman. He shot those patterns with a far superior weapon than the bolt-action Kirkano, and perhaps most importantly, he shot those with a semi-automatic weapon.
The testimony that you will hear is that this weapon is basically a piece of junk. It is not anything like the rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald used when he was in the Marine Corps to score the hits that Mr. Kachet told you about. This is a piece of junk. This sold at the time for $25. It sells today for something like $36. And the reason that we will tell you that this is a piece of junk is because it is very difficult to believe rationally that a person who set out to assassinate the President of the United States would use a piece of junk.
It is an unfortunate weapon. It is not well made. It was obsolete the day it was produced. It is a rough working weapon. The bolt works rough. The trigger is not even in pull. And they were not intended to be well made. They were cheap when they were made. They're cheap today.
Using computer animation, Dr. McCarthy explained the view and shot selections available to Oswald from the 6th floor of the School Book Depository.
The best shot he would have had at the president who was coming head on was as he came up that street.
And you can see that now every vital organ of the president is exposed to the shooter in the repository, and at the closest point in that shot, he's got a shot of 86 feet.
This bird's-eye view of Dealey Plaza shows the effective zone which a gunman would have firing at the president from the School Book Depository. However, the defense alleged that several gunmen were involved, which would increase the effective firing zone. Witnesses located on the grassy knoll testified.
My name is William Newman.
Mr. Newman, where were you standing and whom were you with on November 22nd, 1963, when you were watching the presidential motorcade?
I was standing on Elm Street, just near the west end of the Concrete Standard.
Mr. Newman was standing
Yes.
right there at the edge of the grassy knoll.
Yes.
With your wife and 2 children.
Yes.
Can you identify That man and that woman covering their 2 children?
Yes, that's me and my wife and our children.
And those are your 2 children?
Yes.
And you believe, sir, that the shots came from up behind you?
Right, from behind me up from the elevated garden.
Where were you on November 22nd as the Kennedy motorcade turned into Dealey Plaza?
I was standing in the middle of the overpass over Elm Street.
Now, again, on this same overhead we've been talking about, the same overhead shot, there is a marker agreed to by counsel that says S. Holland, which is right in the middle of the overhead. Is that where you were standing, sir?
Yes, it is.
What did you observe as the motorcade approached?
I heard a loud report, and President Kennedy, he kind of leaned over. Then in a matter of about 2 or 3 seconds, there was another report, but it wasn't nearly as loud as the others. That report came from behind the picket fence, up on top of the grassy knoll. And then at about the same instance as the third shot, there was a louder report that came from up the street, and the 2 were so close together, it was kind of like that.
Evan Chesler argued for the defense that gunmen were located on the grassy knoll.
If Mr. Newman was right when he threw his children to the ground that the shots were from behind him, then the government's theory is wrong, ladies and gentlemen. It cannot be otherwise. Sam Holland. Sam Holland, again, was standing on that overpass. He said, I heard one of the shots not as loud as the others. Remember he said that? One was not as loud as the others. He said it came from behind the picket fence on the knoll. He said 2 police officers came running up. One of them drove his motorbike halfway up that little hill in front of that tree where Mr. Arnold was standing. He threw his bike down, he pulled his revolver, and he went charging up the hill, and the other officer went charging up the hill. What were they charging after, ladies and gentlemen?
It was now time for final arguments. First, the prosecution team.
And as the president drove down Houston on streets with American names like Main Street and Houston and Elm, he took this gun, he put it on the windowsill to hold it, he aimed at the President of the United States, and he shot 3 times. The first bullet, as you have heard from the evidence, which I will review with you, misfired or misdirected. The second bullet went through the President's back and out his neck and into Governor Connally. And our President hunched down to the left, and Lee Harvey Oswald shot a 3rd time, and he hit him in the back, where it entered, and out the side. And we have had to sit here and watch those films because it is important, ladies and gentlemen, that you as jurors, based on this evidence, return a verdict that reflects that evidence. It is important.
And finally, Evan Chesler and David Boies closed for the defense.
We suggest there is more than a reasonable doubt that that person was the person on the 6th floor doing any shooting at all. We suggest that doubts clearly exist as to how many shots were fired, and Mr. Chesler has covered that. Many, many witnesses have testified that there were more than shots, more than 3 shots fired. And the prosecution depends on there only being 3 shots fired, because unless they can demonstrate that there were only 3 shots fired, they can't show you, they can't prove to you which shot killed the president. There was also more than a reasonable doubt as to how many shooters were there. Was there only the single shooter that they say, or were there many shooters?
Miraculously, he accounted for the lead factor, he accounted for the defective scope, he accounted for the fact that he had to operate that bolt and move the gun away from his eyes every single time he did it. You go into that jury room and try to hold this rifle at your eyes, look through it, see something through it, aim it, and try to operate that bolt without ever losing sight of the target and pull the trigger. Do it. I've tried to do it. I can't do it.
The jury deliberated for 2 hours, and 7 of the 12 jurors voted to convict Lee Harvey Oswald, while 5 voted that a reasonable doubt did exist.
I just cannot believe, short of something miraculous, that he could fire that rifle with a poor scope, with a lead time, at a moving target, getting that second bullet off in that short period of time. What was it, a couple of seconds?
I'm ready to find for the prosecution on a lot of the same issues that he brought up, that he was a proven marksman. It was his gun. We have a witness saying that they heard 3 shots come from the 6th floor. They found the 3 shells. There were no shells found in the knoll, no gun found in the knoll, no person seen running from the knoll.
The jurors were then asked by noted trial researcher Dr. Donald Vinson,
of all the evidence you saw, what is the one piece of evidence that most clearly stands out in your mind?
The diagram that showed the direction of the bullets using the cone.
And the computer animation?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I agree with the animation.
The animation.
Also.
The computer animation, I mean, it's logical, it's mathematical, it's not, it's not supposing that there's some assassin or someone else. It makes sense.
Sir, what piece of it?
Yeah. The computer animation combined with the stipulation.
I think the computer animation, but not the one where it showed the 3 cones, the one where they superimposed then the other one that said, okay, this is where it could have been if it had come from the grassy knoll, and they showed the white with the yellow, and it laid right on top. I just felt that fit in there.
Okay.
Computer and animation.
Animation, sir?
The computer animation based on the film.
The computer animation based on the Zapruder film. Okay, ma'am?
And Dr. Pizziali's, all of his testimony. The killing bullet, the 3rd shot, the fragments found on the bone.
it was evident that computer animation, when coupled with modern presentation techniques and traditional forms of demonstrative evidence, was effective in helping to explain to the jury complex analysis of the events surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Due to the time constraints of this mock trial, many of the animation sequences prepared by Spectus Technologies could not be shown. In fact, one of the most compelling examples of animation is the reenactment of what Lee Harvey Oswald would have seen and heard as the 3 shots were fired at the presidential motorcade. In order to recreate the scene, the characteristics of the rifle and scope were measured. Dr. McCarthy of Failure Analysis performed a field test using an exemplar rifle in order to determine the speed at which the rifle could be operated and to measure the motion of the rifle through the fire-reload sequence. The data for the timing and motion of the rifle was then entered into the computer and synchronized with the timing and motion of the presidential motorcade. Using a 3-dimensional representation of Dealey Plaza, the computer model of the Carcano rifle was placed in the 6th floor window of the school book depository. Finally, by simulating the view through the rifle scope and adding the audio track of the recorded rifle shots, the reenactment could be created. No one knows the precise timing of the alleged 3 shots that day. However, 2 different timing sequences are widely accepted. Based on the evidence presented by the prosecution, 3 shots were fired within 8 seconds. Let's see what the view through the scope looks like if 3 shots are fired within 8 seconds. Others hold the opinion that the first shot hit the president in the neck and the 3rd shot hit the president in the head. Thus, Oswald would have had only 5 seconds to fire the 3 shots. By entering the new timing into the computer, we can see the difficulty Oswald would have had to make all 3 shots within the 5 seconds. Let's see then one more time. From the detailed timing of the shots to the larger question of who fired the shots, this historic debate continues.